Daphne Abdella. On May 23, 1997, authorities in New York City responded to a report of a body discovered in Turtle Pond within Central Park. The victim was identified as 44-year-old Michael McMorrow, a real estate agent who had been spending time in the park that evening. What investigators would uncover was that two 15-year-olds, Daphne Abdella and her boyfriend Christopher Vasquez, had been responsible for McMorrow's death in what appeared to be a thrill-seeking incident. Daphne Abdella came from an affluent background, having been adopted by wealthy parents who provided material comforts, including residence in a luxury Manhattan apartment. However, despite the financial advantages, Abdella had been struggling with emotional difficulties that manifested in behavioral problems, including issues with substances, frequent fights, and expulsions from multiple schools. She had developed a pattern of making disturbing statements, including boasts about wanting to harm someone. On the night of the incident, Abdella and Vasquez had been socializing with McMorrow in Central Park. The encounter escalated into an attack where McMorrow sustained numerous stab wounds. According to court records, Abdella had directed Vasquez during parts of the attack. After the attack, they attempted to dispose of the body in the pond. The investigation began when Abdella herself called police to report finding a body. However, when detectives discovered that Abdella's parents had filed a missing person report for her, officers went to the apartment and found both teenagers attempting to wash off what they claimed were stains from a skating accident. Their arrest followed immediately. Forensic evidence, including the weapon and biological samples, linked both suspects to the scene. The autopsy showed over 30 stab wounds on McMorrow's body. Abdella opted to accept a plea agreement, pleading guilty to manslaughter charges, admitting to striking and kicking McMorrow, but denying intent to cause death. Vasquez proceeded to trial where he was acquitted of the most serious charge, but convicted of manslaughter. The jury apparently believed that Abdella had been the primary aggressor. Both received sentences ranging from 3 1/3 to 10 years. During sentencing, Abdella expressed remorse, wishing she could bring McMorrow back. However, McMorrow's brother questioned how such extensive injuries resulted in only manslaughter convictions, expressing that the jury lacked courage to hold them fully accountable. Both were paroled in 2004 after serving approximately 7 years. In 2025, Abdella participated in a Netflix documentary, maintaining that her involvement had been minimal and continuing to distance herself from primary responsibility. The next case would involve a school setting and very different motivations. Alec McKinney. On May 7, 2019, a shooting incident occurred at STEM School Highlands Ranch in Colorado that left one student deceased and several others injured. The perpetrators were two students, with 16-year-old Alec McKinney playing a significant role. McKinney, who was transgender, had been experiencing severe difficulties related to his gender identity and the treatment he received from peers at school. McKinney had a documented history of mental health struggles. He reported experiencing internal voices urging him to harm others beginning around age 12. And these thoughts had persisted for years. He had been offered medication but refused treatment, explaining that he did not want to feel alone and that the voices provided companionship despite their disturbing content. The motivation for the attack centered on McKinney's experiences of being targeted due to his transgender identity. He had faced ongoing harassment from other students, contributing to increasing anger and thoughts of retaliation. On the day of the incident, McKinney had used substances beforehand, which may have further impaired his judgment. McKinney entered a classroom and fired multiple shots, injuring 4 students before being subdued. He also attempted to harm himself, but was stopped by security personnel and students who intervened. The rapid response prevented additional casualties, though the trauma affected the entire school community. The investigation involved extensive interviews, forensic evidence including ballistics analysis, and examination of McKinney's background. Investigators discovered journals where McKinney had documented his thoughts and plans, providing clear evidence of premeditation. They also learned that the firearms had been stolen from someone known to the perpetrators. McKinney was arrested at the scene and faced numerous charges as an adult despite his age. He ultimately pleaded guilty to 17 charges in a plea agreement, requiring him to testify against his co-defendant. During his sentencing hearing in 2020, McKinney addressed the court and victims' families, expressing remorse. In his statement, McKinney promised to live as a changed person and specifically addressed others considering similar acts, urging them to seek help immediately. However, victims' family members also provided impact statements. One father told McKinney he had taken something irreplaceable and expressed hope that McKinney would not find peace. The court sentenced McKinney to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years, plus additional years for other charges. Due to his transgender status, McKinney was placed in a women's correctional facility. As of 2025, McKinney remains incarcerated and has not yet been eligible for parole consideration. But the next case would involve different circumstances and a much earlier era. Ruth Ann Veal. In 1993, authorities in Iowa investigated the death of 66-year-old Catherine Haynes, who had been found deceased in her home with numerous stab wounds. The investigation would reveal that 14-year-old Ruth Ann Veal had been responsible for Haynes's death during what appeared to be a robbery that escalated into a deadly confrontation. The case would raise questions about juvenile culpability and appropriate sentencing for young offenders who commit serious crimes. Veal had been living in difficult circumstances, with a home environment characterized by instability and mistreatment. She had a history of running away from home, suggesting that she was trying to escape a situation she found intolerable. These background factors would later be presented during legal proceedings as context for understanding how she had ended up in Haynes's home that day, though they would not excuse her actions. The incident occurred when Veal entered Haynes's residence, apparently with the intent to steal items and possibly the victim's vehicle. A confrontation ensued between Veal and Haynes, and during this struggle, Veal used a knife to stab Haynes multiple times. The autopsy revealed 23 stab wounds on Haynes's body, indicating a prolonged and violent attack. After Haynes was deceased, Veal took her car and credit cards, leaving the scene in the stolen vehicle. The investigation involved processing the crime scene for evidence, which yielded important forensic findings. Investigators discovered a fingerprint at the scene that would prove crucial in identifying Veal as a suspect. They also found bloodstains and a footprint that could be analyzed and compared to potential suspects. When Veal was arrested in June 1993, investigators were able to match the evidence from the scene to her, providing strong physical proof of her presence during the crime. During police interviews, Veal made statements that would later be used in court proceedings. She reportedly told someone that she had gotten ruthless during the incident, suggesting an awareness of the extreme nature of what she had done. However, when speaking directly to police, she denied being capable of taking someone's life, creating contradictions in her various statements that prosecutors would highlight during trial. The legal proceedings involved significant debate about whether Veal should be tried as an adult or remain in the juvenile system. Ultimately, she was waived to adult court and faced trial as an adult despite her age at the time of the crime. The trial lasted 3 weeks and involved testimony from numerous witnesses, presentation of forensic evidence, and arguments about Veal's state of mind and culpability. The defense presented information about her difficult background, but the prosecution emphasized the severity of the attack and the theft that followed. The jury convicted Veal of first-degree charges and she was initially sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This sentence meant she would spend the rest of her life in custody, with no opportunity for release. However, the case would later be affected by changing legal standards regarding juvenile sentencing, particularly U.S. Supreme Court decisions that placed restrictions on mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles. In 2013, Veal was resentenced to life with the possibility of parole due to these new legal standards. This resentencing meant that after serving a minimum number of years, she would have the opportunity to appear before a parole board and make a case for release. The resentencing reflected evolving views about juvenile brain development and the potential for rehabilitation, even for those who commit serious crimes while young. During her decades in prison, Veal participated in various programs including hospice volunteering, working with other incarcerated individuals who were terminally ill. This work demonstrated an ability to show compassion and provide care for others, which her supporters cited as evidence of rehabilitation. After serving over 20 years, Veal eventually gained supervised release, transitioning from prison to community supervision. As of 2025, Veal is living in an Iowa community under supervision conditions. Her case continues to be cited in discussions about juvenile sentencing reform and the question of whether young offenders should ever receive sentences of life without parole. The debate continues between those who believe age should significantly mitigate punishment and those who argue that some crimes are so severe that lengthy sentences are warranted regardless of the offender's age. The next investigation would cross an ocean to London. Joshua Alexander. In 2023, authorities in London responded to a shooting incident in Hackney, where 42-year-old Leanne Gordon had been shot through her door and fatally wounded. The investigation would reveal that 17-year-old Joshua Alexander had been responsible for the shooting, which was connected to ongoing gang conflicts in the area. The case highlighted the persistent problem of gang-related incidents and youth involvement in serious criminal activity in parts of London. Alexander had been involved in gang activity and the associated conflicts over territory and respect that characterized much of the gang culture in his area. The shooting of Gordon appeared to be connected to these ongoing disputes, with Gordon potentially being targeted due to connections to rival gang members, or simply being in the wrong place when Alexander was seeking to send a message through an act of targeting. The randomness of her selection as a victim made the crime particularly troubling to investigators and the community. On the night of the incident, Gordon was at home when shots were fired through her door. She sustained fatal injuries and died at the scene despite emergency response efforts. The shooting shocked the neighborhood and prompted an intensive investigation by Metropolitan Police, who recognized that solving the case quickly was important both for justice and for preventing potential retaliation that could lead to additional incidents. The investigation involved extensive forensic work, including analysis of the firearm evidence and any traces left at the scene. Investigators discovered firearm residue on a glove that could be linked to Alexander, providing crucial physical evidence connecting him to the shooting. They also examined Alexander's communications and social media activity, discovering content including references in his music that appeared to relate to gang activity and incidents of targeting. Alexander was arrested at his residence, where investigators executed a search warrant and collected additional evidence. During police interviews, he was questioned about his whereabouts on the night of the shooting and his involvement in gang activity. The evidence gathered during the investigation, including the forensic findings and the circumstantial evidence from his communications, built a strong case against him. The trial took place in London's criminal court system, with prosecutors presenting the evidence linking Alexander to the shooting and arguing that he had deliberately targeted Gordon as part of gang-related activity. The defense attempted to challenge the evidence and raise questions about whether Alexander had been properly identified as the shooter. But the combination of forensic evidence and other findings proved compelling to the jury. Alexander was found guilty of taking Gordon's life, and the court proceeded to sentencing. Given the severity of the crime and Alexander's age, the judge sentenced him to life in prison with a minimum term of 29 years before he would be eligible for parole consideration. This sentence meant that Alexander would be in his mid-40s at the earliest before having any possibility of release, effectively ensuring he would spend the majority of his youth and adult life in custody. Gordon's family provided impact statements during sentencing, describing their loss and the senselessness of her death. As a mother, she had been caring for her family when her life was cut short by gang activity she had no part in. The family expressed frustration that gang conflicts continued to claim innocent lives and called for greater efforts to address the root causes of gang involvement among young people. As of 2025, Alexander remains incarcerated in the British prison system. His case continues to be referenced in discussions about gang activity in London and the appropriate response to youth involved in such serious crimes. The debate continues about whether lengthy sentences deter gang violence, or whether more resources should be directed toward prevention and intervention before young people become deeply involved in criminal activity. Another case would involve a school principal in a very different setting. Eric Hainstock. On September 29, 2006, a shooting occurred at Weston High School in Cazenovia, Wisconsin, where 15-year-old Eric Hainstock shot the school principal, John Klang. The incident shocked the small rural community and raised questions about warning signs that might have been missed and whether the school could have done more to prevent the tragedy. Hainstock's background would reveal extensive difficulties that had contributed to his actions. Hainstock had been experiencing severe mistreatment both at home and at school. His home environment was characterized by instability and harm, with documentation of physical mistreatment by family members. At school, he had been the target of persistent harassment from other students, with the situation apparently worsening over time. These combined pressures had been building, and Hainstock had reportedly sought help from school staff, but his concerns had not been adequately addressed. On the morning of the incident, Hainstock brought firearms to school that he had obtained from his home. He confronted Principal Klang, apparently intending to discuss his grievances and the lack of response to his reports of being targeted. The confrontation escalated, and Hainstock shot Klang multiple times. Despite receiving immediate medical attention, Klang succumbed to his injuries, leaving behind a family and a school community devastated by the loss of their leader. Hainstock was arrested at the school immediately after the shooting. The investigation involved collecting the weapons, interviewing numerous witnesses, including students and staff, who had observed parts of the incident, and examining Hainstock's background to understand what had led to the shooting. The forensic analysis confirmed that Klang had sustained gunshot wounds that caused his death, and the evidence clearly established Hainstock as the shooter. During the legal proceedings, significant attention was paid to Hainstock's background and the factors that had contributed to his actions. The defense presented evidence of the mistreatment he had suffered and argued that the school had failed to protect him despite his reports of being targeted. They emphasized his age and the extreme circumstances that had driven him to such a desperate act. However, prosecutors argued that regardless of his difficulties, taking a life could not be justified, and that Klang had not been responsible for Hainstock's mistreatment. Hainstock was convicted and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Meaning he would be eligible for parole consideration in 2037 when he would be in his 40s. During his time in custody, Hainstock has written letters to media expressing regret for what happened and frustration that no one had listened to his pleas for help before the situation reached its tragic conclusion. Hainstock's father spoke about his son in interviews, describing him as not being heartless and suggesting that circumstances had pushed him beyond his ability to cope. The family's perspective highlighted the complexity of the case and the multiple failures that had contributed to the tragedy, though it did not excuse the taking of Klang's life. As of 2025, Hainstock remains incarcerated in Wisconsin's prison system with no recent news about parole considerations. He will not be eligible for parole until 2037. And whether he will be granted release at that time will depend on his behavior in prison, his participation in programming, and the parole board's assessment of whether he poses a risk to public safety. The final case in this set would involve more recent events and disturbing circumstances. Roland Delacruz. In September 2024, authorities in Idaho responded to the discovery of human remains that would lead them to investigate the death of Dax Richens. The investigation revealed that 16-year-old Roland Delacruz and his co-defendant, Alexander Garcia, had been responsible for Richens's death in a premeditated attack motivated by a false accusation. The case demonstrated how misinformation and rumor could lead to tragic and irreversible consequences. Limited information is available about Delacruz's background and upbringing, though court records indicate he was 16 at the time of the offense. What became clear during the investigation was that Delacruz and Garcia had believed or claimed to believe that Richens had committed a serious offense against someone they knew, and they had decided to take matters into their own hands, rather than allowing authorities to investigate the allegation properly. This decision would prove to be based on false information. The attack on Richens was not spontaneous, but rather involved planning and coordination between Delacruz and Garcia. They lured or arranged to meet with Richens under some pretense, then carried out an attack that involved both beating and stabbing. After Richens was deceased, they attempted to conceal the crime by burying his body in a location they believed would prevent discovery. However, their attempts at concealment would ultimately fail. The investigation began when concerns were raised about Richens' disappearance. Authorities eventually located remains, with a skull leading them to discover where the body had been buried. The forensic examination revealed the cause of death and the nature of the injuries inflicted on Richens, establishing that he had been the victim of a deliberate attack rather than an accident or natural death. The evidence collected from the scene and the autopsy findings would prove crucial in the prosecution of both defendants. Both Delacruz and Garcia were arrested and charged with taking Richens' life. The investigation involved interviews with both defendants and any witnesses who might have information about the planning or execution of the attack. During these interviews, investigators learned about the false rumor that had motivated the attack and established that the accusation against Richens had no factual basis, making his death even more senseless. The legal proceedings resulted in both defendants pleading guilty rather than proceeding to trial. Delacruz's sentencing occurred in October 2025, where he received a life sentence with 23 years fixed before being eligible for parole consideration. During the sentencing hearing, Delacruz addressed the court and made a statement expressing remorse for his actions and asking to be allowed to suffer the consequences of what he had done. The statement reflected some level of acknowledgement that his actions had been wrong and that he deserved punishment for taking Richens' life based on false information. However, no amount of remorse could undo the harm that had been done or restore Richens to his family. The victim's family members likely provided impact statements during sentencing, though specific details of their statements are not available in public records. As of 2025, Delacruz is incarcerated in Idaho's prison system, beginning to serve his life sentence. He will not be eligible for parole consideration until he has served 23 years of his sentence, meaning he will be approaching 40 years old at the earliest opportunity for release. Whether he will be granted parole at that time will depend on numerous factors, including his institutional behavior, participation in programs, and demonstrated rehabilitation. If you've made it this far and enjoyed deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next case would involve a relationship conflict that spiraled into tragedy. Caitlin Coons. In 2023, authorities in Ohio investigated the disappearance of Nicole Jones, a woman who had been reported missing by concerned family members. The investigation would reveal that 17-year-old Caitlin Coons had been responsible for Jones's death, with the incident stemming from Coons's romantic relationship with Jones's son and Jones's disapproval of that relationship. Coons had been living in foster care and had a history of running away from her placements, suggesting instability and difficulty forming secure attachments. She had developed a romantic relationship with a young man whose mother was Nicole Jones, and this relationship had become central to Coons's sense of identity. However, Jones had expressed disapproval of the relationship, apparently believing it was not healthy for her son and attempting to discourage or prevent the couple from continuing their involvement. The conflict between Coons and Jones escalated as Jones maintained her opposition. According to the investigation, Coons had issued an ultimatum to her boyfriend, essentially demanding that he choose between his mother and their relationship. When the situation did not resolve in the way Coons wanted, she decided to eliminate what she viewed as the obstacle preventing her happiness. The attack on Jones involved Coons using a rock as a weapon to strike Jones repeatedly, causing fatal injuries. After Jones was deceased, Coons disposed of the body in a location where it has not been recovered. During police interviews, Coons admitted to what she had done, providing investigators with information about the attack and her motivations. However, the location of Jones's remains has remained unknown, denying the family the ability to properly lay her to rest. The investigation involved interviewing family members, examining phone records and communications, and tracing the movements of potential suspects. When Coons became a focus, authorities worked to gather supporting evidence. Her admission during questioning provided crucial information, though the absence of physical remains complicated the forensic aspects. Coons was arrested and charged with taking Jones's life. She ultimately decided to plead no contest to the charges rather than proceeding to trial, which meant she did not admit guilt but acknowledged that the prosecution had sufficient evidence for a conviction. In 2024, Coons was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. This sentence meant that she would be in her 40s before having any opportunity for release. Jones's family members have continued to seek information about the location of her remains and have also pursued a wrongful death lawsuit related to the case. As of 2025, Coons remains incarcerated in Ohio's prison system. Her boyfriend, Jones's son, also faced legal consequences related to the case, receiving his own sentence for his involvement or knowledge of what had occurred, but the next case would take place across the Atlantic in London. Aris Lloyd Hall. On New Year's Eve 2023, 17-year-old Aris Lloyd Hall attended a celebration in London to watch fireworks and ring in the new year with crowds of other young people. However, what should have been a festive occasion ended in tragedy when Lloyd Hall became involved in a confrontation that resulted in the death of Harry Pittman, another teenager who was present at the event. The incident shocked London and raised questions about youth carrying weapons and the potential for minor disputes to escalate into fatal encounters. Lloyd Hall had been carrying a knife at the celebration, later explaining that he did so because it made him feel powerful and confident. This admission revealed a troubling mindset where weapons were viewed as tools for gaining respect or authority, rather than being recognized as dangerous implements that could cause irreversible harm. The fact that he brought a knife to what was meant to be a celebratory gathering suggested either an expectation of trouble or a habitual carrying of weapons that had become normalized in his life. During the crowded New Year's Eve event, some kind of physical contact occurred between Lloyd Hall and Pittman. Accounts suggest this may have been an accidental bump or jostle in the packed crowd, the kind of minor contact that typically results in apologies or simply being ignored as people navigate crowded spaces. However, rather than treating it as the inconsequential incident it should have been, Lloyd Hall's temper flared and the situation escalated rapidly. The confrontation resulted in Lloyd Hall stabbing Pittman in the neck, causing a wound that proved fatal. Emergency services responded to the scene, but despite their efforts, Pittman died from his injury. What had begun as a celebration ended with one teenager dead and another facing prosecution for taking his life, all over a moment of contact that should have been meaningless. Lloyd Hall was arrested days after the incident as investigators worked to identify and locate him. The investigation involved reviewing witness statements from the numerous people who had been present at the crowded event, examining any available video footage from the area, and collecting forensic evidence. The forensic analysis confirmed the nature of Pittman's injury and established how he had died, while witness testimony helped establish the sequence of events that led to the stabbing. The case proceeded to trial, where Lloyd Hall faced charges related to Pittman's death. The trial actually involved a retrial, with Lloyd Hall ultimately being convicted in October 2025. The prosecution presented evidence about Lloyd Hall carrying the knife, the confrontation that occurred, and the fatal wound he inflicted on Pittman. The defense may have attempted to argue about Lloyd Hall's state of mind or suggest that the incident had been less calculated than prosecutors claimed, but the jury ultimately found him responsible for Pittman's death. Sentencing occurred in November 2025, with Lloyd Hall receiving a life sentence with a minimum term of 16 years before being eligible for parole consideration. This sentence reflected both the seriousness of taking a life and the Lloyd Hall's youth at the time of the crime. The minimum term of 16 years meant that Lloyd Hall would be in his 30s before having any opportunity for release, though whether he would be granted parole at that point would depend on numerous factors, including his behavior during incarceration. Pittman's family provided impact statements during the legal proceedings, describing their devastation at losing him on what should have been a joyous occasion welcoming a new year. Instead of celebrating new beginnings, they were mourning the loss of a young life cut short over nothing more than a momentary bump in a crowd. The senselessness of the incident made their grief even more difficult to process. The next case would involve very different circumstances and charges. Randall Hallman. In 2022, authorities in Suffolk County, New York, responded to a home invasion incident where a residence had been broken into and serious offenses had been committed against an occupant. The investigation revealed that 14-year-old Randall Hallman had been responsible for the break-in and the subsequent actions taken inside the home. The case raised troubling questions about youth criminal behavior and the appropriate response when very young individuals commit serious offenses. Limited information is available about Hallman's background and the circumstances of his upbringing. Public records do not provide extensive details about his family situation, school experiences, or whether there were warning signs that might have predicted such serious criminal behavior at such a young age. The lack of background information makes it difficult to understand what factors might have contributed to Hallman's decision to commit the offenses that led to his arrest and prosecution. The incident involved Hallman breaking into a residence where a woman was present with her child. Once inside the home, Hallman committed serious offenses against the woman, including both assault with a weapon and other harmful acts. The presence of the child during these events added an additional traumatic element to the situation, as the child witnessed at least part of what occurred. The nature of the crimes demonstrated a willingness to cause serious harm to vulnerable individuals in their own home. The investigation involved collecting forensic evidence from the scene, including documentation of the injuries sustained by the victim. Medical examinations confirmed the nature and extent of the harm that had been inflicted. Investigators also worked to identify the perpetrator through physical evidence and any witnesses or information that could lead them to the person responsible for the home invasion and assault. Hallman was identified as a suspect and arrested. During the legal proceedings, he faced charges related to both the home invasion itself and the specific acts committed against the victim once inside the residence. Given his age, there were questions about whether he would be prosecuted as an adult or remain in the juvenile justice system, with the severity of the crimes weighing in favor of adult prosecution, despite his youth. Hallman ultimately pleaded guilty to the charges against him, avoiding a trial where victims would have had to testify about the traumatic events. The guilty plea meant he acknowledged responsibility for what had occurred and accepted that the prosecution had sufficient evidence to convict him. The plea also likely involved negotiations about sentencing recommendations, though the final determination would be made by the judge overseeing the case. In 2024, Hallman was sentenced to 3 to 9 years in prison, a sentence that was significantly shorter than what adults convicted of similar crimes might receive. The reduced sentence reflected considerations about Hallman's age and the philosophy that juvenile offenders have greater capacity for rehabilitation than adults. However, the sentence still represented substantial time in custody given his youth, ensuring he would spend a significant portion of his teenage years and possibly early adulthood incarcerated. It is important to note that Hallman's case does not involve taking a life, which distinguishes it from most of the other cases in this examination. His inclusion in this review may reflect a broader interpretation of serious juvenile crime, rather than specifically focusing only on cases involving fatalities. The serious nature of his crimes, particularly the assault with a weapon, warranted significant legal consequences despite not resulting in death. As of 2025, Hallman remains incarcerated, serving his sentence. The victim in the case has had to cope with the trauma of what occurred in her home while her child was present, an experience that has likely had lasting effects on both of them. The case highlighted the vulnerability of individuals in their own homes and the importance of addressing youth criminal behavior before it escalates to such serious levels. Another case would demonstrate the deadly consequences of reckless behavior. Noah Gala. In 2022, a horrific traffic incident occurred in Florida when a vehicle traveling at extremely high speed crashed into another vehicle, resulting in multiple fatalities. The driver responsible for the crash was 17-year-old Noah Gala, who had been driving at 151 miles per hour while creating content for social media. The case demonstrated the deadly consequences that can result when individuals prioritize online attention over public safety and make catastrophically poor decisions behind the wheel. Gala came from an affluent family background with access to resources and opportunities. However, rather than using these advantages responsibly, he had developed a pattern of engaging in extremely dangerous driving behavior for the purpose of creating videos to post on TikTok and other social media platforms. This behavior reflected a mindset where gaining views, likes, and followers online took precedence over the safety of himself and others on the road. The pursuit of social media fame through dangerous driving had apparently become a regular activity for Gala. He would record himself driving at excessive speeds, capturing the speedometer showing triple-digit velocities and his reactions to the adrenaline of traveling so fast. These videos were then posted online, where they might garner attention from viewers, reinforcing the behavior and encouraging him to continue seeking thrills through reckless driving. On the day of the fatal crash, Gala was driving at 151 miles per hour, more than double the speed limit on most roadways and a velocity at which it becomes nearly impossible to react to changing traffic conditions or maintain control of a vehicle. At this speed, any obstacle or need to brake becomes catastrophic, because physics prevents successful maneuvering. The vehicle Galley struck was carrying 6 farm workers who were simply traveling to or from their workplace. The collision resulted in the deaths of all 6 occupants of the other vehicle. The force of the impact at such high speed was unsurvivable for the victims, who had no warning and no ability to avoid the crash. The farm workers were individuals with families and lives ahead of them, all cut short because someone decided that creating social media content was more important than driving responsibly. The magnitude of loss? 6 lives ended in a single moment, shocked the community, and drew attention to the dangers of attention-seeking behavior online. The investigation into the crash involved examining the wreckage of both vehicles, analyzing data from Galley's vehicle that recorded his speed at the time of impact, and reviewing his social media accounts where he had posted videos of previous high-speed driving. The speed data provided irrefutable evidence of how fast he had been traveling, making it impossible to argue that the crash had been a simple accident. The social media videos established a pattern of intentional reckless driving for entertainment purposes. Galley was arrested and charged with vehicular offenses related to the deaths of the 6 farm workers. The prosecution presented the evidence of his speed, his social media activity, and the entirely preventable nature of the crash that resulted from his deliberate decision to drive at such dangerous velocities. The defense may have attempted to argue for leniency based on his age and lack of intent to specifically cause deaths. But the prosecution emphasized that his reckless choices had direct and foreseeable consequences. Galley pleaded guilty to the charges, and in January 2025, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. This sentence meant that he would be in his late 20s or early 30s when released, having spent a significant portion of his youth in custody. However, many observers felt that 12 years was insufficient punishment for 6 lives lost, particularly given the completely avoidable nature of the tragedy and Galley's documented pattern of dangerous behavior. The families of the 6 farm workers provided impact statements during sentencing, describing the men who had been lost and the holes left in their families. These were working people who had been contributing to their communities and supporting their families when they were killed by someone seeking online fame. The disparity between the value of human lives and the trivial pursuit of social media attention was stark and painful. As of 2025, Galley is incarcerated, serving his 12-year sentence. The case has been cited in discussions about social media's influence on youth behavior and the need for platforms to take more responsibility for content that promotes dangerous activities. Some advocates have called for stronger consequences for individuals who post content showing illegal or dangerous behavior, arguing that the pursuit of online attention is contributing to real-world harm. The next case would involve a pattern of offenses and a different kind of sentence. Tremonte Kirk. In 2024, authorities in Wisconsin investigated a series of serious offenses targeting women in the Milwaukee area. The investigation revealed that 17-year-old Tremonte Kirk had been responsible for multiple incidents involving assault against vulnerable individuals. Kirk's case demonstrated how patterns of harmful behavior can escalate over time if not addressed through intervention, and raised questions about early warning signs that had been missed. Kirk's history of problematic behavior extended back to age 12, when he had first come to the attention of authorities for offenses involving other individuals. He had been diagnosed with conduct disorder, a psychological condition characterized by persistent patterns of behavior that violate the rights of others and disregard age-appropriate social norms. Despite this diagnosis and early interventions, Kirk's behavior had escalated rather than improved as he entered his teenage years. The offenses Kirk committed in 2024 involved targeting women whom he perceived as vulnerable, selecting individuals he believed would be unable to effectively resist or report what happened to them. This calculated selection of victims demonstrated a level of planning and predatory behavior that distinguished his actions from impulsive crimes. The multiple incidents established a clear pattern, leading investigators to recognize they were dealing with a repeat offender. The investigation involved collecting biological evidence from the crime scenes that could potentially link the various incidents to a single perpetrator. DNA analysis proved crucial in connecting Kirk to multiple offenses, providing scientific proof of his involvement that would be difficult to challenge in court. The DNA matches gave investigators confidence that they had identified the person responsible for the series of incidents that had been terrorizing women in the community. Kirk was arrested and faced numerous charges related to the multiple offenses he had committed. Given the serious nature of the crimes, the pattern of behavior, and his prior history, prosecutors sought substantial prison time. The case proceeded through the legal system, with Kirk ultimately being convicted of the charges against him based on the DNA evidence and other investigative findings. In November 2025, Kirk was sentenced to 35 years in prison. The sentencing judge made particularly strong statements about Kirk's character and actions, describing his behavior as evil. This unusually harsh characterization from the bench reflected the judge's assessment of Kirk's calculated targeting of vulnerable victims and his demonstrated lack of remorse or empathy for those he had harmed. The 35-year sentence meant that Kirk would be in his 50s before being released from prison. It is important to note that Kirk's case, like Hallman's, does not involve taking a life and therefore represents a different category of serious juvenile crime than most others examined in this review. His inclusion may reflect the severity and repetitive nature of his offenses rather than specifically focusing on cases involving fatalities. However, the substantial sentence he received, longer than some individuals who have taken lives, demonstrates that courts can impose severe punishments for other categories of serious crime when circumstances warrant. As of 2025, Kirk is incarcerated, serving his 35-year sentence. The final case would involve limited information and uncertainty. Dadrian Marty. Information about a case involving someone named Dadrian Marty is extremely limited and uncertain. There appears to be some connection to a Tucson house party incident in July 2025, where someone named Dadrian Brown was a victim rather than a perpetrator. This suggests possible confusion about names or roles in the incident, making it difficult to provide accurate information about a specific individual named Dadrian Marty as an offender. The available information does not clearly establish whether there is a person named Dadrian Marty who has been convicted of serious crimes and is serving a life sentence, or whether this name represents a misspelling, confusion with another case, or some other error in information gathering. The lack of reliable court records, news reports from established media outlets, or official statements makes it impossible to verify basic facts about this supposed case. When examining cases of juvenile offenders, it is crucial to rely on verified information from credible sources such as court documents, established news organizations, and official law enforcement statements. The absence of such sources for a case involving Dadrian Marty raises questions about whether such a case exists in the form being claimed. If there was indeed a house party shooting in Tucson in 2025, authorities would have investigated the incident, identified suspects, and pursued charges against those responsible. The lack of documentation for an offender named Dadrian Marty suggests that either the case is too recent for comprehensive information to be available, or that there may be inaccuracies in the initial information about this individual. It is also possible that the name Dadrian Marty is a variation or misspelling of another name associated with a real case. However, without such clarification, it would be irresponsible to present speculative information as fact. The difficulties in verifying information about this case highlight the importance of careful research when examining criminal cases, particularly those involving juveniles. For the purposes of this examination, Insufficient verified information exists to provide a comprehensive account of a case involving Dadrian Marty comparable to the other cases presented. As of 2025, no verified information confirms an offender named Dadrian Marty serving a life sentence for serious crimes. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.